There we go. There we go. There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is W. Kamau Bell. I've known for a lot of things, most recently Celebrity Jeopardy Champion 2025. Anyway, which makes me the second most smartest person who will be on this stage today by far. All right, few reminders before we get started. This program is being recorded, so we kindly ask you to silence your cell phones. Also, if you have any questions for our guests, please fill them out on the cards that will be handed around. They're on your seats, and then someone will collect them. Or if you're on YouTube, you can do it through the chat. And now, our featured guest. So, our featured guest was raised in Maryland and is a graduate of Harvard University. In 2021, she was named Time 100 Next List and has also received the National Urban League's Women of Power Award. Throughout her career, she has covered national politics, campaign finance, lobbying, and several presidential campaigns. She most notably anchors Newsnight with Abby Phillip on CNN as the author of the new book, A Dream Deferred, Jesse Jackson and the Fight for Black Political Power. Please welcome to the stage, Abby Phillip.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Last time I saw you was on the set of your show Newsnight.
Yes, I dragged you in.
Yes, and then I dragged myself out. It's a lot of Scott Jennings. Anyway,
everybody says that.
It's a lot. It's in real life, it's really a lot. It's like, okay. So first of all, congratulations on your book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So I have to admit, when you reached out to me and said, would you do this? In my mind, I was like, oh, it makes sense that Abby would write a book. And I assumed it was a memoir, because that's what everybody's first book is. So what made you not do that? Because I'm sure publishers were like, yes, we'll take the Abby Phillip story.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that the thought of a memoir, my initial reaction was, hell no, at least at the beginning. I mean, I'm not ruling it out. I wanted my very first book to be a piece of journalism, because I'm a journalist. I covered politics. I love history. And I think that there is still so much to learn. And in the moment that I was conceptualizing this book, it was 2020. So we all know all the things that were happening there. There was George Floyd, there was COVID, there was the 2020 election. And I think all of those things kind of came together in making this story seem like one that needed to be told now, in this moment. One of them was just this idea that there are these chapters of history and these figures in our history that haven't really been scrutinized and analyzed, and particularly not from the perspective of someone like me, like a Black woman who can look at it from a different lens. But I had also covered 2016 and 2020. I had covered the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. And in the 2020 election, Jesse Jackson actually endorsed Bernie Sanders in Michigan. And a lot of people were like, that's weird. Why? Why would Jesse Jackson endorse Bernie Sanders, of all people? When it was clear at that point that Bernie Sanders was not the candidate, for example, of a majority of Black voters. And the answer was that they actually have way more in common than I think many people realize in terms of their political message, their economic message. And that I think that Bernie Sanders is this sort of modern day manifestation of what Jesse Jackson's 84 and 88 campaigns were all about. And that's what this book is really about. It's about not just what happened in those times, but also, are we still living through a moment in which what Jesse Jackson ran on is still being litigated? It's still relevant today, and maybe even more relevant in the future as we look at the AOCs and the Mamdanis of the world and what they're trying to do with our politics. So, yeah.
So what was it about his story specifically with you? Because, that you were like, I got to write about this guy.
I think part of it also was that I didn't know much about this, actually. I was born like 3 weeks after the 1988 campaign was over. So.
Like most of us in this room. Like, yeah.
So I was a twinkle in my mother's eye, I guess, when all of this was going down, and so actually I think that I came to it with fresh eyes, but I also felt like as a Black journalist in media, there are not a lot of histories that are written by people like me, and when I started digging into it, and I was reading these stories and looking at the clips and the video and all of that stuff, I was really struck by the way in which who told the story really mattered. It mattered then. I think it matters now. And I was just like, there's just a whole other part of this story that just nobody talked about. Nobody talked about the way, what Jesse Jackson meant in particular to Black Americans, and how they saw him completely differently. And I think taking that lens on it felt like something that was important to do.
Now, as we sit here today, the news came out that Jesse's in the hospital right now.
Yes.
I just want to give him a little time for you to. I know you're still in touch with his family.
Yeah. So I've been in touch with his family this week, and I mean, as you all know, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease about 10 years ago, but they actually believe now that it's a slightly different disease in the neurodegenerative family. But in any case, his health has been failing for some time now. I mean, I last spoke to him last summer during the DNC convention in Chicago. But since then, he's had a really rough go of it. He is in the hospital. He is under treatment. I would say he's responding somewhat to treatment, but it's clear that he is near the end of his life. And so, his family has asked for prayers, and I think we'll continue to do that. But, this is sort of these are the final chapters of a very long, extraordinary life. 60 years in the public eye for Jesse Jackson. He's 84 years old. He just had a birthday. So, they're by his side in the hospital and just praying for him.
Oh, I think one of the, so often a figure like Jesse Jackson, they will pass away, and then people will say, let's remind you of what this person's historical value was or what their cultural value was. And I don't think, and people of your age, and this now, he was an icon at a certain point.
Yes.
One of the most famous Black people in the world.
Totally.
And I'm happy for him and his family that although this is not a puff piece, this is not a, that there's a thing that his family has and that he has in his life that talks about his impact.
And it was important to do it while he's alive, because I also felt one of the problems with trying to do a book like this after the fact is that you rely on only the history that has already been written. And it was very clear to me that there were a lot of stories that needed to be collected from him and from people who were there. And so, it was important to do it in this particular moment when not just he, but a lot of his aides are, they're also in their 80s. And some of them were older than him when he was doing this stuff, because
he was the young guy.
He was, in his late 30s, essentially, when this was going on. And early 40s. And so some of these people some of them passed away as I was writing this book. So I wanted to get to that. But to your point, I mean, there was a point at which I had to go to him and say, sir, will you talk to me for this book? And he's a big cable news guy. He used to have a show on CNN, so he's a big...
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. I think it was called Both Sides with Jesse Jackson.
That sounds right.
Yeah. That's
as far as he wants to bring people together and have the discussion.
Years, for some
Not the way we think of
90s.
Both Sides now. But
right, exactly. Exactly.
Some people believe the world is round, but also we have this person.
Not that kind of Both Sides.
Yeah.
But he had that show on CNN, so he was happy to talk to me. But I did have to tell him, I was like, Reverend Jackson, this is going to be a real book, like an actual book, and it's going to have things in there that maybe you don't want to talk about, maybe are not the most flattering, but it has to have that texture of realness, right? Because he is this complex figure. He's got some personality traits that make him so polarizing, popular, but also polarizing. Yeah. And that's all captured in the book as well.
Well, I mean, as far as speaking for the Black community, which I do very rarely, I do. I mean, you might be like, no, but I do. You generally don't. When I do it, I say, I'm about to speak for the Black community. We understand that one of the most complicated figures in the Black community is anybody whose moniker is Reverend.
That's true.
Yes. And I say that because we understand, we sort of automatically, Reverend, we accept a level of complication,
right,
knowing that has historically
right.
come with a level of complication.
Yeah. It's a tradition. There's a tradition. You know, the civil rights tradition that he comes out of, which I think what many of you, I'm sure you know, but what's important to understand about that is that was the vehicle. The church was the vehicle by which people could engage with politics, could engage with social justice, could engage with the rest of this country and not be seen as a threat, frankly. And so a lot of people like Reverend Jackson, they came into the church through both channels, both a moral channel and also the social justice channel. But it doesn't mean that they weren't humans. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that they didn't have flaws, mm-hmm. but it also doesn't mean that those flaws should overshadow their consequence. Mm-hmm. And I do think there's this temptation that we want to keep people pure, mm-hmm. in order for them to be seen as heroic. First of all, the argument is not that anybody should be just sort of put in a hero category. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that it's easier for people to reckon with people's legacies when it's A, short, mm-hmm. or B, simple. And I think that that's not really how history works. That's not really how these people are. These are humans. And especially if you're going to run for president, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It takes a little something, yeah. And that something is not normal. It is not a thing that normal people do.
No.
It is a thing that you do if you have an incredibly outsized ego. It is a thing that you do when you have, frankly, daddy problems, as many of them do.
That's tracking so far.
Right?
Well, I'm thinking about Jesse Jackson.
It is a thing that you do when you really think that you are the only person in the world that can do something. And imagine what it must be like to think that you are the only person in the world who can do something. So people who run for president, they're going to be multidimensional and they're going to be layered. And that's no different. Jesse Jackson is no exception to that. And in so many ways, I mean, he just has had this long life that there is all this complexity. So it's harder for people to be like, well, he's famous for this one thing.
Yeah.
He was not famous for any one thing. He was famous for a lot of things. And that's what makes it, I think, harder for people to understand what his impact was.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the ego thing, because I think that people often think that I wish this person who wants to be president didn't have such a big ego, and you're like, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work like that.
It doesn't work that way. Or I wish this reverend had a smaller ego. That's not how.
Right.
That's not how.
Right.
We just, I can go on about that, but we'll do that at the Black people meeting.
Next time.
But I do want to say, because you did talk about the importance of Jesse Jackson, especially for people of my generation and older, in the Black community. But then there's even a hyper-focused or hyper-real, importance of Black people in a city called Chicago.
Yes, yeah.
Where his impact is even more outsized and people have more love for him, specifically in the Black community. Can you talk about his relationship to Chicago? Yeah. Which is funny, because Chicago loves to adopt people if they like them.
But he's not really from Chicago.
And I think most Chicagoans will be like, yeah, I remember where he was born, in the South Side. But
yeah. No, he's from the South.
Yeah.
He's from the South. And he ended up in Chicago for a couple of reasons. One, he went to seminary school, the Chicago Theological Seminary. But also, he when he came into Dr. King's movement, he kind of bogarted his way in. He was like 24 years old and was like, I need a job, give me a job, I'll do anything. And Dr. King gave him a job. And one of the jobs that he gave him was Operation Breadbasket in Chicago. And that was the sort of economic justice branch of the mission of the SCLC that Dr. King was leading at the time. And I just did an event in Atlanta with Ambassador Young. And he actually explained it in a way that even I had not really quite heard it. I mean, I'd heard him talk about it in other ways, but the way he put it was that prior to Chicago and Jesse Jackson going to Chicago, all of Dr. King's sort of deputies, they'd been working in Birmingham, Selma, Atlanta. They were in the South. And the South was comfortable. It was relatively warm. It was small. It was relatively small. It wasn't that complex. And nobody wanted to go to Chicago. It was too cold. The city was huge.
Yeah.
The politics were the ethnic politics.
Yeah, the neighborhood politics.
The neighborhood politics. It was so complex. All of the other folks said, not me. I'll take a pass. But Jesse Jackson was tasked with doing it. And then it turned out he was really good at it. He got in there. He got all of these church leaders who were kind of honestly sort of warring with each other in different ways over congregations and all of this stuff. And he didn't have a congregation. So he was able to get in there and say, let's work together on this. Then he started working with business leaders, the head of Jet, the bank owners, all these people, the black middle and upper class. And he brought them all in the same room and gave them all a sort of unifying mission, which was to use the economic power of black people in the city at that time as leverage to make changes to housing, to make changes to how these companies operated, grocery stores that would operate in poor black communities and put rotten fruit and vegetables on the shelves, and also wouldn't hire black people to work there and pay living wages, wouldn't allow black people to own franchises, all of these things. And so he was really good at that and became a power player in Chicago and in a lot of cities in the North, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, and other places where Breadbasket had arms. And that was really how he learned leverage, which is really the vehicle that he used to operate not just in economic spaces, but also in politics as well.
Well, and I think it's funny, I think about this. It wasn't until Jesse Jackson was such a Chicagoan to me because me and my mom moved there in '84, and he was in the height of what we're going to talk about soon about his run for presidency. That it wasn't until later I was like, oh, he knew Martin Luther King Jr.?
Yeah.
Like I was born in '73, so after that, so I didn't realize.
So
that
back in '73, he had already broken from Dr. King's organization and started his own Operation Push. And so, around that time, it was the Jesse Jackson of Chicago Fest and, bringing big acts like Stevie Wonder and others to Chicago or the boycott of the Chicago Fest that happened later on, where he told them not to come. And all these massive cultural acts listened to him and said, we're not going to come into Chicago until we get the things that we're asking for. And so at that time, he was a very Chicago figure. When Fred Hampton was killed, I tell this story in the book. When Fred Hampton was killed by the Chicago police, sort of under the direction of the FBI, essentially, right after that happened, Jesse Jackson was one of the first people to get a phone call, because they were coming after Bobby Rush next, who was also a Black Panther. And Bobby Rush wanted to surrender at Jesse Jackson's Saturday morning Operation Push meetings, these massive meetings that he would have with like hundreds, like 700 people on Saturday mornings. And so he arranged it. Bobby Rush came there, and the police were waiting for him in the wings. They sent a black officer because they didn't want it to look bad. And Bobby Rush gave a speech, and he surrendered himself right there with Jesse Jackson. And it was meant to be a signal of what the black community was. First of all, that they were watching what happened, and that they were sort of unified in their opposition to it
and recognizing their power.
Yeah. And so he was, even though he wasn't a Black Panther, and honestly they did not really subscribe to his methodology or politics or anything like that, but they knew that he had a certain kind of influence, and that continued well into the 80s,
Yeah.
when you were in Chicago.
Yes, yes.
When Chicago finally got its first black mayor.
Which is, as I told you backstage, that's my mom and I were living in Boston, and in classic Janet Bell fashion, she was like, "This racism has grown boring to me."
Let me go somewhere.
Yeah,
else.
I don't like this. I don't like the flavor of this racism anymore. It's exhausting. Actually, not boring, exhausting. And Harold Washington was either running for mayor or had won the mayorship, and she wanted to move to a city that was in charge, that a black person was in charge.
Yeah.
So we moved to Chicago.
Yeah, and this was before, I think today Chicago is frankly mischaracterized as just being about black crime. I think that's sort of the media narrative of Chicago.
Yes.
And so as a result, it's
Pushed by a president with daddy issues.
yeah, as a result, it's seen as sort of like a black city. But in that time, in 1983, there were a lot of black people in Chicago, but they didn't have political power, really. They could never really get to the mayorship, which was an incredibly powerful office, until Harold Washington. And Jesse Jackson played a really important role in that. He, along with other black leaders in the city, they strong-armed Harold Washington into running for mayor. Harold Washington was like, no, thank you. And then he said, well, if you raise, X amount of money and you register, 500,000 new voters, maybe I'll do it. And he didn't think that they would be able to do it. And guess what? They did. They used radio, they used Operation Push and those Saturday morning meetings, and they did exactly what he asked them to do, and he had no choice but to run. And he ran, and they showed up, black voters showed up en masse. I think he got like 90% of the black vote in the city. And really showed what could happen when black voters all show up in a particular way. And completely changed the politics of that city in a way permanently. Because prior to that time, voters of color were basically boxed out of power. There were other ethnic groups, Polish Americans and others, who had a lot of power. But black voters were sort of like in the machine, but never in charge of the machine.
Yeah.
And Harold Washington really marked the true end of the machine politics era in Chicago and the beginning of a new era in which those constituent groups in that city had influence. And it was similarly in the way that I think Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns used black power as a vehicle. Harold Washington's campaign used black power as a vehicle to open up power more broadly to a lot of different people in the city. And I think that was the model that Jesse Jackson modeled his presidential campaigns on.
Well, let's talk about that. I think because I remember as a child, Jesse Jackson running for president, it certainly was played in the press as a novelty, and he got attention because he was famous.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of how could a person who has no political experience think they could be the president of the United States when they've had no political office ever before in their life? Who is this? Who is this man?
Think
Right? that he could just go from being a private citizen to being the
Right.
president of the United States? Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that literally is it. I mean, he was, as I've often been saying, he was a celebrity candidate before Donald Trump was a celebrity candidate. He was probably actually way more famous than Donald Trump in that time. And he was completely sidelined as a figure because every news article practically was like, well, the Reverend from Chicago is running for president. Mm-hmm. He has no shot, but here he is.
But he's a good interview, so we'll talk to him.
Yeah. And I think that this idea that he had no depth because he had not been in politics before was very pervasive. And I think it was wrong, just frankly. Having talked to people, having actually looked very deeply in a way that I think a lot of people who were sort of covering those races did not look beyond just the headline of he's running to make a point. He actually had I think, a very rare skill in politics, which is the ability to take really complex information on a wide range of subjects and make it understandable and meaningful to the masses. And I cannot tell you how hard that is for politicians to do. Most of them really don't know how to do it. A lot of them have trouble marshaling the subject matter, just the facts of foreign policy, of economic policy, of how it works together. And then on top of that, layering politics. A lot of people just can't do it. And he really could do it. You know, his aides would tell me that right before they were getting ready to prepare him for a speech or a debate in Iowa, they were giving him these briefs about farm policy and agricultural policy. And he was like a machine, just taking in all the details. And he would go on that debate stage and talk in great detail about ag policy in a way that none of the other candidates were doing, because they weren't really talking to those voters. You know, he was the only one really talking about farm foreclosures, about the need to support America's, you know, food base of people who are producing food in this country. America First. Jesse Jackson was running on America First in 1984 and 1988. It looked different, but the fundamental principle was we should be taking care of ourselves. We should be bolstering our manufacturing base, our farming base. And so I think he had this intellectual depth that doesn't get acknowledged. And a lot of it was because I experienced this in 2016 when we were covering that campaign and the Bernie Sanders of it all. There's just like a complete disbelief in the media that anybody who doesn't fit a traditional narrative of what a politician looks like can resonate. And it's really hard to break past that disbelief. And Bernie Sanders was able to do it because he was able to raise grassroots money, and we have the internet.
And we have the internet, yes.
Jesse Jackson did not have, actually, the benefit of, they don't have, you know, Act Blue or whatever. Like, that didn't exist in the 80s. And he also didn't have the internet. So he had to go through the sort of mainstream media channels. And it was very difficult, I think, for him to break through as a result.
Yeah, and I think there's, you know, even around what you're saying is his ability to synthesize information, which most people don't know, that he was actually like a brilliant person. But then also, as you're saying, I know there's a generation of black people when I was a kid who were like, oh, Jesse Jackson invented rap. Just because he used to rhyme all the time.
Right.
He used to, everything ended with a rhyme. There was always, he used to, there was a chorus when he was speaking. Yeah, I am somebody, you know what I mean? Like, and just the idea that would have played very well in a way that maybe it did not play the same back then.
He was memorable.
Yeah.
He was memorable. And I think also he had this way of connecting through imagery, these concepts that he was creating. You know, he was this was part of the church tradition. He was a very descriptive person. He used also the Bible and biblical concepts to bring people in who otherwise would really want to listen to him. And yeah, I mean, the rhyming, the sort of lyricism of his words. I wish I could remember them now because my brain doesn't work that way. But the lyricism of the way that he spoke was his calling card for so long. And actually that has inspired so many people who came after him.
Yeah, I can think of one in particular that we'll talk about in a little bit. Also a Chicago man who was not from Chicago.
He's not from Chicago.
So how, through the work you did in the book, you talk about how close did he get? Like, if you look at like 84 and then 88, because it was like the run in 84 was like, whoa, and he tried to do it again.
Yeah.
How, like, you know, where's the sliding door moments that you're like, if this had gone this way?
I mean, it was definitely 88.
Yeah.
So 84 for the Jacksonites is the campaign that was like the breakthrough moment where this sort of coalition was born. But 88 is really where it all kind of came together. And in particular, the Michigan primary, this was in March of the Democratic primary, He's in Michigan, and he's campaigning in the rural parts, he's campaigning in the cities, on college campuses, and he wins the Michigan caucus and doubles the vote share of Michael Dukakis, who was the frontrunner, the presumptive frontrunner at that point. And all of a sudden, everybody is like, wait a second, what's going on here? Jesse Jackson had an outright delegate lead in that moment. He also, for the first time, Jesse Jackson was like, wait a second.
I've got a delegate lead in this moment.
That was the funny thing, talking to his aides. They were like, yeah, for the first time, we started to think about, I guess we have to put a cabinet together. Like, who's going to be the education secretary and all this stuff. They were really thinking for the first time, wait, he might actually have a shot at this. And that was also when the pushback to him went in overdrive. The Democratic Party, their number one goal in that moment was stop Jesse, okay? Run, Jesse, run was stop, Jesse, stop.
Yeah.
Okay? And the headlines, Time Magazine, all the magazines were, what does Jesse want?
What does he want? To be the president? No, what does he really want?
What does he really want?
Yeah. What does he black want?
What does he really want? I mean, there was a sense of panic internally in the Democratic Party in that moment. Mm-hmm. Because I think what the Michigan caucus did was it made it very clear that it wasn't just black voters. That here he was in the North, in a state that was kind of mixed in terms of the demographics, and he was resonating. And he was resonating in other parts of the North too. And then they were looking ahead and they were like, well, okay, New York is coming up. And, they were doing the math in their heads. Mm-hmm. And I think we're growing very concerned. However, what really stopped the momentum was the fact that actually Jesse Jackson winning was the thing that made a lot of voters be like, oh, wait, are we going to do this for real? They were like, wait, are we sure?
Like some people were doing like a protest vote that they turned into a real vote?
Some people were like, yeah, he made a lot of sense, but they didn't really think that it could result in him being the nominee. And so the other candidates were hammering him on experience, on, I think the 1980s version of electability, what we would say is electability, although they didn't use that term, but his ability to do the job. And they were hammering him on that. And it worked with voters. A lot of voters who were very interested in his message, felt like he was the only person speaking to them. They were convinced that actually you can't really elect a reverend president. You can't really elect a black man president. And I think the argument was made that the Republicans in particular wanted him to be the nominee because they felt like they could beat him. Mm-hmm. So, and maybe all of that was true. Or there was some truth to all of that. But by the time he got to the Wisconsin primary, a reversal happened. Mm-hmm. The doubts really rose up in a way that, his campaign manager, I think still to this day thinks that, if he had come close in Michigan but had not won as resoundingly, he might have actually done better in the primaries that went after. But the win in Michigan was such an earthquake that it was sort of like a wake-up call to the electorate and a wake-up call to his opponents to actually take him seriously. And they hammered him all the way to the end. But he came in second place in 1988. And was really at the height of his political powers. 1988 was really when he was able to, I think, marshal a lot of control over the Democratic Party in the primary, changing the platform, changing the delegate rules, installing his aides in the party, people like Ron Brown, who went on to be DNC chair. And so 88 was really where it all kind of came together for him.
Well, talk about the delegate rule specifically, because they still hold to this day.
They still
They're
hold to
different
this
than
day.
the Republican delegate rule.
Yeah. So one of the big things that he said back in the 80s was that the winner take all system that the Democratic Party had, which is that if you win one state and you get 40% of the vote, a plurality, you get all the delegates.
In the primary. Yeah.
He said that's unfair. He was also, by the way, railing against superdelegates 30 years before Bernie Sanders was. And so he changed those rules to make it proportional. And 20 years passes, and here comes Barack Obama, an outsider, relatively outsider political candidate.
Weirdly didn't have experience as a politician, even though he was in elected office.
Yeah, not much.
Yeah. But I'm saying people were like, doesn't have experience. He's in elected. I'm not talking about that kind.
He'd just been elected to Senate. He was young.
Yeah.
And he was running against Hillary Clinton, who was the establishment candidate. And had it not been for those rule changes on the delegates that Jesse Jackson pushed through, Barack Obama would not have been the nominee. He just would not have been. Hillary was still winning the big states. She was winning California. She was winning the big delegate shares. But Obama was chipping away at her numbers progressively, primary after primary after primary. And because of that, he was able to topple the establishment candidate. And that is exactly what Jesse Jackson envisioned when he pushed for that change. And that's one of the, I think, on a concrete level, if there was nothing else that you remember about Jesse Jackson, that is one thing that you should remember. Because it's not just about Obama. It's also about the way in which party systems are set up to keep outsiders out. They are set up to bolster the establishment. And he saw that, and he campaigned against that and changed it in a way that I think opened the door not just to Obama, but will open the door for future candidates who are challenging the status quo.
So I feel like I have to bring up this other thing that happened in '88, which is famously was one of the scandals of his '88 campaign that I remember as a Saturday Night Live sketch done by Eddie Murphy. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes, although this was 84.
This was 84.
This was 84.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Okay, so
although it still played a role in 88.
yeah,
I will
like
say that.
it's
yeah.
okay. So how it was a viral moment before there was virality of Jesse Jackson in New York referring to New York through a slur of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
That that has like stuck with his legacy to this day.
Totally. And so this is, I think, the major drama of these campaigns. And I'll start actually, 1983, he's run for president. And the very first thing he does, pretty much, is he leaves the campaign trail to go to Syria to bring back an American prisoner of war.
Yeah, he used to. That was a thing he did.
Well, and really, that was the first time he did it.
Okay.
The first time he did it successfully was in '84, in the '84 campaign. So it's 1983. He gets on a plane. He goes to Syria. He's sitting with, Assad, and he's like, free Lieutenant Goodman, who happened to be black, happened to be from New Hampshire. So this is like a major coup, in this campaign. He's going into the New Hampshire primary, having brought back one of their native sons that the Reagan administration could not bring back. Ronald Reagan invites him to the White House, and he's there cheesing with the guy who he's running to replace in the White House. Then a couple of weeks passes, and there's a Washington Post article, and it says in like the 30th paragraph, and privately, Jesse Jackson has referred to Jews in New York or into New York as Hymietown. Nobody notices it. It's buried in the 30th graph of a Washington Post article. A couple weeks more passes, and it surfaces, and he's asked about it on, I think, Meet the Press, and he says, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't say that, and that's when the whole thing explodes. It was not actually heard by the person who wrote the Washington Post article, but it was heard by another Washington Post reporter who then told it to his editors, and it ended up in this story. So it was a massive controversy about whether he had actually said it, whether if he said it in private and it was meant to be off the record, or all this stuff. And he didn't own up to it, which I think was one of the big things about it, was that he didn't own up to it at first until it got to such a fever pitch that he had no choice. And eventually, he gave this speech in New Hampshire in a synagogue, apologizing for using that phrase and explaining his relationship with the Jewish community. But at that point, it felt like the ship had sailed. The tensions between him and Jewish American leaders had been building for years. And a lot of it had to do with his advocacy for a Palestinian state and his advocacy for diplomatic relations with, at the time, the PLO, which was considered to be an extremist organization. And I think, layered on top of this was Louis Farrakhan, who was a Chicagoan, who over many years had a very close relationship with not just Jesse Jackson, but pretty much everybody in Chicago. Harold Washington was there at I think it's called Soldiers' Day or something like
Savior's
that.
Day.
Savior's Day. Harold Washington was there. Every elected leader in Chicago would show up at these Nation of Islam events with Farrakhan. And when Jesse Jackson was traveling all around the country leading up to 1983, registering voters, he had the unofficial security that was Nation of Islam members who would come and stand outside the door of these churches and serve as his security.
Which I just want to say is a pretty usual thing for black people who are not Muslims. If you don't know who you can call to protect you,
yes,
you can call the Nation of Islam.
And when he went to Syria to free Lieutenant Goodman, Farrakhan was on the plane. And Farrakhan, as a Muslim, was able to talk with the Syrians. And that relationship also helped Jesse Jackson bring Goodman back. So people were asking him, are you going to denounce Farrakhan? Because Farrakhan has said all kinds of anti-Semitic things. And he resisted. And I tried to understand that because I think it's important to understand it. Because I think the way that Farrakhan is seen in the black community is very different from the way that he's seen more broadly.
For sure.
That's just a sociological thing that is real. And specifically, I asked a lot of people, he's running for president. Why was it so hard for him to say, I got to get this guy away? I can't be answering for every little thing that he does. Farrakhan at one point obliquely threatened the reporter who reported on the Hymietown comment. So it was a huge problem for him. And a lot of people told me that one of the reasons he didn't do it was because he morally did not like the idea of abandoning people in his community because of their, let's put it this way, because of their sins. And
when you're complicated, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you just have to sit with it for what it is, right? I mean, did it hurt him? Absolutely. Was he convinced that that was what he had to do because he didn't see himself as a political figure? He saw himself as a religious, moral leader? Yeah. And so that decision, or set of decisions, I think was incredibly consequential, not just in how 84 went, but also how he was just dogged by this in 88, and also, frankly, for decades after.
It's funny that this is where we're getting to the Q&A from the audience, but I feel like I have to ask you this question. So I remember how sort of, I don't know if shocked was the word, but how it affected me that when Barack Obama is giving his acceptance speech for when he wins the election, he's in Grant Park in Chicago, giving his acceptance speech, and you see Jesse Jackson not on stage with him,
Yeah.
not in the front row.
Yeah.
The camera like finds him like somewhere in the back of the
Somewhere in the
crowd,
audience,
and there's
yeah.
a tear going down his face, what we call a glory tear in the black community. And it just seems so like, as a person who lived in Chicago, like so wild to me that Jesse's not closer, or that
Yeah.
Jesse's not being invoked, and
Yeah.
that he's not, whatever. As we said, complicated human being, but like it can't be more clear that therefore that guy there now you.
Yeah. There is this direct line, obviously, between Obama and Jesse Jackson and Obama. And it's not just because they're black.
No.
It's also because, literally, as we just discussed, Obama would not have had a shot at the nomination had Jesse Jackson not run. The delegate rules are one thing, but also the way in which Jesse Jackson was instrumental in building up the black electoral base that was the foundation of Obama's campaign. The people who were out in the field, the voters who showed up en masse to make sure that his support was rock solid going into that general election. But the Obama campaign was well aware that Jesse Jackson comes with baggage. And they actually kept him at arm's length because, some of it is, it's not as cynical as it sounds. I think it's also just realist that in this country, Jesse Jackson and the tradition that he comes out of was always viewed as threatening to Americans. He was his announcement speech in 1984 was described in the New York Times as aggressive. That's what the word. Yeah,
Oh, like
the
Zoran
word is.
Mamdani's
Yeah.
acceptance speech
It was
was.
described- Jesse Jackson said in that speech, he was like, we're going to make the Democratic Party take us seriously. Black people, women, Asian Americans, all these people. And that was filtered through the New York Times and interpreted as aggressive, almost to the point of threatening. And so black people who were of that tradition were viewed as being a little too militant to appeal to the average white American. And I think the Obama campaign was not wrong about that when they understood that that would be a problem for him. Because one of the main things that he had to do was he had to hold on to black support while also pivoting to the political middle, but also to white Americans, and convince them that he was not a threat. But, there was also the hot mic moment where, Jesse Jackson said in a commercial break on Fox News.
Where they keep those hot mic moments in? Yeah.
He said in the commercial break that Barack Obama, he keeps talking down to black people. I'm going to cut his, off. It didn't go down well. And I think there is, I think there was a lot of ego at play. Here's this guy who was like, I was here before you. You wouldn't be here without me. And he did want a little bit more acknowledgement than Obama was willing to give him. But Obama, on the other hand, was like, can't you just pipe down while I'm you know what I mean? Like, I think that there was a sense that they were just walking this tightrope. And the gaffes didn't help. The kind of slights, I think there was sort of a building of this resentment between them as men.
Yep.
But you have to also remember Jesse Jackson Jr., his son, was a co-chair of Obama's 2008 campaign. They were close. They were friends. And Santita Jackson, Jackson's daughter, was Michelle Obama's maid of honor at their wedding. So they go.
I don't think all of us could remember that. We didn't know it until now, yeah.
Yeah, they go back. So there is, look, it's complicated.
I think the thing that it comes down to for me is like you just never see white politicians have to pivot from their complicated people.
Well,
this is not you. I'm just saying that's how it sort of feels like you don't have to be like.
This is America.
This is America. Oh, that's right. It is. Yes.
But
Donald Glover's song comes in right now. Yeah.
I do think that there's so much of Jesse Jackson that was a bit before his time.
Yeah.
And in a way, sometimes America does need the white man to do it first. before it's okay for a black man to do it. So like the celebrity candidate, the candidate who kind of is, not taking the traditional path, who's running against his own party at first and is trying to, all of that stuff that Trump did successfully. And Jesse Jackson was not allowed to do those things in the 1980s, and neither was Obama.
And yet I'm sure in some way, even for Trump, seeing Jesse Jackson do it was like, oh, if he can do it.
Yeah. I mean, again, before Trump, even when Trump was sort of flirting in '88, he actually was talking about running for president at that time. Jesse Jackson was running for president. And Trump was actually trying to glom onto Jesse Jackson's fame, more or less. There's a photo in the book of them at Atlantic City at Trump's hotel. And they're with Don King. And so Jesse would go to fights, and how Donald Trump likes fights. He still liked them then, just like he likes them now. And Jesse Jackson was at the fight, and Trump calls and is like, I want to show you around the property. So he pulls Jesse Jackson out of the post-fight party and starts showing him around the property. It is completely bananas insane. There is so much media and gawkers and cameras and paparazzi, and they're going down this escalator, and the escalator stops because there are too many people on the escalator, and then they all just like lurch forward. And it's just like a scene of how, at that time, Donald Trump knew that Jesse Jackson was one of the most famous people in the country at that time, and wanted him close. And so they had interactions not just in the 80s, but in the 90s with Jesse Jackson's Wall Street Project. So I do think that, in a way, there's no doubt in my mind that I think Jesse Jackson seeded actually a lot of a way of doing politics that I think Donald Trump then carried out. Even the way that the 84 and 88 campaigns were so unconventional, unpredictable. He would do things that no other candidate would do. I mean, not the least of which was getting on a plane and going to another country and freeing a prisoner of war. And so, Donald Trump took that to the nth degree and did it, running against the party, the populist economic message, the worker, the message about the American worker, I think is taken straight from Jesse Jackson. When you read the 84 speech, Jesse Jackson talks about, the sort of rusted out parts of America that have been abandoned from factories going overseas. Again, this is something that if you listen to Donald Trump's 2017 inaugural address, and you hear a lot of the same themes that 30 years earlier Jesse Jackson was running on. And you can imagine that if the Democratic Party had keyed in on that, on the discontent in middle America about jobs being shipped abroad, I think that there would be we might be even living in a different politics than we are living in today.
All right. Well, thank you. We have a few questions, a little bit of a speed round since we've had such a good conversation. Thank you for this. So this one I'll answer this one because I started on this, but it's sort of in that area. How do you keep your composure when Republicans will not answer questions honestly? We'll call this the Scott Jennings. The Scott Jennings Memorial question. And I just want to zoom out because I see people, I'm too much online. People who are fans of yours who sometimes feel like they want you to and I get, but please speak to that idea.
Yeah.
And I've seen you, I want to be clear.
Don't worry, I get this a lot.
After Jillian Michaels did what she did, you said the next day, I'm like, I got about 20 minutes on this I need to talk about. That you opened the show with. So this
is the most common question I get asked. I understand. First of all, I'm one of 6 kids in my family, so I'm used to a big family of all kinds of different personalities. Not new to this. But I also think that, look, my job isn't to have my head explode when everybody else's head is exploding, right? I think there are plenty of people at the table whose heads are exploding, and it doesn't need to be mine. My job is to let people have their say, but also to push for more, to push for people to actually answer the question if I can. But here's the thing. I'm not putting people on truth serum at the table, right? I don't have that power. And so you push and you push until it becomes apparent to everybody at home they're not answering the question. And I think that's part of it, is just to, I think, be an advocate in a way for people at home, which is to say that when people are coming to the table and it's not in good faith, calling that out, just sort of being like, really? Like, I think that, because I know you know what that feels like. Are you serious? You know? And sometimes that's all that you need. But look, I mean, we really believe in people having the space to have their points of view, even if you don't like them, even if you think they're wrong, even if they are wrong. And I have a tough job. I have to fact check. I have to mediate. I have to traffic cop, all of that stuff.
You have to get to commercials. I mean, that's the other part.
I got to pay the bills. I got to get to commercials. And it's not perfect, obviously, every single night. But what we try to do is create the space. And I can't force people to be intellectually honest, either party. I feel like I have to say that because I feel like every time I talk about this stuff, people think I'm only talking about conservatives. I'm not. I cannot force anybody to be intellectually honest necessarily. But what we're doing is pressing on ideas, challenging talking points, challenging the conventional wisdom sometimes. And hashing it out. And that looks a little bit messy. Sometimes it gets a little loud, but that's okay. Somebody's got to do it.
So obviously, and just not to make too fine a point on this, there's like people who come through the show just every now and again. I was on the show once, but then there's like Scott Jennings is clearly the crew. You know what I mean?
Well, he works.
That's what I mean. He's got a contract with CNN.
Yeah, like
I don't mean that. Like
CNN.
Yeah. So, do you feel? I don't know how to even say this. With is there more space for him because he's an employee of CNN?
No, I mean, I think the thing that people don't understand is that a lot of people don't want to do what Scott does. Like, they're not willing to sit at the table and be challenged.
Yeah.
So, in a way, what he's doing is actually saying, yeah, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And so he takes all comers.
Yeah.
And that is to his credit. And it's not that we're like, you can't come back or whatever. It's like a lot of people are just like not up for it.
Yeah.
And
there isn't up for it. There is like a be in the arena and spar.
Yeah.
You can't be like, I am just offended and I'm not speaking for the rest of the panel, which is what I try to do.
I just think that that's an underappreciated element of it, is the degree to which there are many, many people who just don't feel up to the task. And, or they only want to do it a certain amount, or, they can't, because the thing about the show is that every single day, if you watch, regardless of the news, we're going to talk about it from beginning to end. And you have to be the type of person who is capable of engaging on every single topic every day. And sometimes you don't get to choose which days you're a yes for, because we book our panels in advance. So I'm just saying, Scott is willing to be in the arena in a way that I think is to his credit, in a way that many other people are not willing to be. And he doesn't get any passes. If you watch, he doesn't get a pass at all. But it's friendly. He takes it. He and I are friends. And he knows that what we're doing is having a back and forth. We're having a dialogue. And that dialogue involves sometimes me drilling down on something that he said and really pressing him on it. And he's okay with that. So he's okay with that in a way that a lot of other people are not. And I think that is one of the reasons that he is here at CNN, but it's also one of the reasons that he's on the show a fair amount.
Yeah, no, he's. We'll move off from that topic. Obviously, I could talk about that for a long time. We'll go to something easier. Vice President Kamala Harris. I'm just kidding. This is easier. Was recently quoted as saying the Democratic Party took black women for granted last year. What is your view on that, and how does the party do better? Assuming that they've already assumed you agree.
Took
black women for granted last year. In terms of the vote.
I don't know that I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if she's talking about herself, her personal experience, and I don't know the context, so I won't dwell on that. I don't know that that's what happened last year. I don't know if that's the story of the 2024 election.
Can you tip your next book?
I think, that's not going to be my next book. just spoiler alert. I don't think that's the story. Look, I think black women in the last election, as they have in, let's call it every election since at least 2008, are a driving force of democratic politics. They are the workers. They are the poll workers, the canvassers, all the things. So I personally think that black women continued to play their role, as they always have. However, I think that the party had other problems, including a complete misreading of the mood and the sentiment in the electorate. And it goes beyond just the campaign. I think that the campaign is the culmination of governance. And it had to do with how the 4 years of the Biden administration was actually carried out. And so, yeah, some of it was baked in the cake even before Kamala Harris became the nominee. But, yeah, I don't think that. The reason I disagree with the premise is because I think black women continue to be a force in the party, and I don't think that changed in 2024. But I think that where the failure happened was actually in other parts of the electorate that were not properly understood. And also, frankly, I do think that there were some black people who also thought that they were not being understood, that their concerns about the economy were not taken seriously, et cetera. So I think all of that, it's complicated, but black women should always be taken seriously. I just think that in the last election, that's not what this was about.
Okay. Last question, another easy one. What are some of the biggest challenges facing journalists today? I ask this one because we live at a time where everybody can call themselves a journalist.
That's it.
Yeah,
the fragmentation of the information ecosystem is the biggest challenge. Everybody can call themselves a journalist, and also, just riling people up works. And you don't need facts to do that. You just need, so-and-so owned so-and-so. And this person, watch this person absolutely dominate this person. And can you believe this? And okay, all of that goes viral. It works. It makes people a ton of money. Podcasts, everything. And so we are living in an information ecosystem that is rewarding outrage and antagonism and owning whoever. And in that environment, facts don't always rise to, the top. And I think we have to be honest about that and figure out what to do about it. I don't know that we can really do anything per se, but I think we need to be a lot more engaged in the exercise of meeting people where they are, giving them information where they're consuming it, not creating as many gaps that can be filled by people who are driving up clicks and views just solely out of outrage. We have a lot of work to do in the media, and so much of it is structural because we're just stuck in these institutions ourselves. And So making that transition to the places that people are consuming information and competing with the outrage machines is going slowly, but it needs to happen a lot faster, and it needs to happen way more creatively and way more aggressively if we're going to just have the chance at giving people more options. There are a lot of people out there who do want more than just outrage, and I think we need to do a better job of being there to offer them up something.
Abby Phillip, everybody, give a round of applause. Buy her new book, A Dream Deferred. I've been Debbie Kamau Bell. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.